coming to you from downtown Ottawa, Ontario. This is the capital of Canada, overlooking Parliament Hill. So welcome, everybody. Yesterday, we brought you the Holy Father's arrival in Edmonton, Alberta. That's one of our prairie provinces here in this beautiful country. And as he began his historic pilgrimage of penance in Canada. Although he did not make a public address, he looked to be in good health, walking at times, but most of the time he spent in a wheelchair. He was greeted by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Governor General Mary Simon, as well as Grand Chief George Arcan. So, and also, of course, there were our own leaders of the Catholic Church in Canada. It was great to see. Cardinal Collins, and just a wealth of our leaders and shepherds here in Canada greeting the Pope. A real special day, I think, for all of us, but one for reflection, which we're going to get into today. Holy Father Pope Francis will be in Alberta today and tomorrow, and will also make stops in Quebec and Iqaluit before he departs home on Friday evening. This morning's event at Maskwacis, it's the first it's the first formal event on Pope Francis' journey of healing, reconciliation, and hope. Here he will encounter First Nations, Metis and Inuit peoples on their traditional territories. For the many survivors present for this event, the journey today will be physically, emotionally, and spiritually challenging. So I think this is a good opportunity for all of us to keep them in our prayers today. I'd like to welcome our guest for today's broadcast, Father Raymond J. D'Souza. Father Raymond D'Souza is of the National Catholic Register and pastor at Holy Cross Parish in Kemptville, Ontario. Father Raymond has written extensively on Indigenous issues in Canada, and we're honored to have you join us this week, dear Father. You're just in from Poland. You flew in from Poland.
I got back yesterday. Good to be with you.
Yeah, world traveler. Well, thank you for... Thank you.
And we were together in my parish in Kemptville for the 7 Last Words earlier this year. So it's nice to be here for this week with you. Thanks, Kevin.
Well, great. Looking forward to having you with us. And for the next few days, we are blessed to have Dr. Cecil Chabot. He's the co-founding member of the Indigenous Catholic Research Fellowship. Cecil is a scholar who has worked with the Canadian and U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Holy See as a delegate. His work explores the interconnections between Indigenous, Catholic, Western, and other histories and cultures, and seeks to bring them into deep dialogue on fundamental questions on human nature. Welcome, Cecil.
Thank you.
How are you today?
Doing very well, thanks.
Very good. Well, it's good to have you on the broadcast. It's a very, very special day for many people, and including yourself, of Cree. You grew up in a Cree.
I grew up in a Cree community. My parents, French-Canadian settler heritage, but I was born and raised in a Cree community. And so, I've been in and around these questions and this particular issue for a long time. And I'll just say up front, this is, it's been 40 years at least that this has been on my radar. I've been in and around the issue, and it's still a challenge to. Every time I come to the question, it's a very challenging one to address, and I'm always asking myself, do I have the nuance right? Is this the right way to approach this? So it's really this is a new context for me. I'm an academic, usually giving lectures. I have a lot of time, so live coverage. I've asked both of you here to help me, not get lost in footnotes. But I'll just say that there's one key point is just that we can't cover everything here. Yeah. So the most important point to take away is that there are no simplistic narratives, things that can sum up everything. Hopefully, this will open for those who are interested. Open the opportunity to dig much deeper into some of this history, the difficult things that we're going into. So.
Well, yesterday we put the whole broadcast under the patronage of St. Kateri Tekakwitha, Lily of the Mohawks. Father, you're mentioning 10 years, is it?
She was canonized 10 years this October, so October 2012, she was canonized by Pope Benedict. I think the last canonization, because he abdicated the following February, so 10 years ago, and she's she converted down in what's now upstate New York in Orisville, and she had to leave that village when she became Catholic. And she died. She came north and she died near Montreal where her tomb is. So it's a good patron to have this week.
Yes, well, we asked for St. Catery's intercession, as well as Saints Joachim and Anne, whose feast day is tomorrow. With
St. James the Apostle today.
there
Not
you
bad,
go, St.
Kevin.
James. Okay, well, we're
Not bad at all.
We're blessed. We're going to be
blessed.
blessed today, and we call and we storm heaven for the prayers, and not just for the broadcast. Of course, there's so many emotions this week, and rightfully so, and so much confusion as well. And we hope to kind of distill a few things today. It's I think for all of us, I guess maybe I'll start with you, Father. It's an apology. This trip is all about apology. Why has the Holy Father flown here? Maybe you can give us your perspective for this apology.
Well, last Sunday he spoke about this as a penitential pilgrimage, which is rather unique. I mean, most papal trips have multiple themes. He meets with young people, meets with seminarians, meets with families, so on, anniversaries. This is one theme over several days, which is reconciliation and repentance. He called it a penitential pilgrimage. So what is he here apologizing for? And that needs to be clarified. So the history of the Catholic Church in what we now call Canada goes back to the early 17th century. We're talking about the French colonies. But when Canada became a country, 1867, not long after that, the federal government decided to implement an education policy for what we now call Indigenous Canadians or Aboriginal Canadians, or as our American viewers would think, Native Americans. And that policy set up residential schools. It was a federal government policy. At first they were voluntary, later they became mandatory, so children had to go there, separated from their families. Now, who's going to run these schools? The federal government isn't going to find any federal government bureaucrat who's going to go out into the remote areas of the country, so it was Christian missionaries. So the schools were run largely by churches, Catholic, Anglican, Protestant. The Catholics ran about 60%, 60 to 70% of them, and the majority of the Catholic schools were run by oblates. And these schools lasted about a century. The last one closed in 1996, but they were kind of in sort of their heyday for about 100 years. Now, as you can imagine, in these remote areas, children taken away from their families, living in harsh conditions, they encountered both heroism and they encountered horrors in those schools. And in 1990, one of the leaders, his name is Fontaine, we're going to be seeing him throughout this, kind of broke the silence on this. It was obviously known in the Indigenous communities for a long time, but it kind of came out to the general population that in a lot of these schools for a long time, a lot of horrific things happened. Partly it was negligence, and sometimes it was just abuse of all different kinds. And so Canada now for 30-some years has been wrestling with that legacy of the residential schools. And there have been some key moments along the way. One was Chief Fontaine in 1990 breaking the silence. Then came the response from the churches, which actually was first before the government. And the oblates, who ran most of the Catholic schools, had a very comprehensive apology. It's 4 pages in length, very detailed about abuses, but also about the schools in principle, like the logic. Was it the right thing to do to take these students away? Was it the right thing to do to try and suppress their languages and their Indigenous cultures? And there was a very complete repentance back in 1991 from the oblates. Then followed the Presbyterians, the Anglicans. Then came the government. And then basically there was a big settlement of all this in 2006, which involved about a $4 billion payment from the federal government. Then there was the apology. Right here, we're looking at it over here in Parliament Hill. The Prime Minister apologized in the House of Commons in 2008. It was a very historic moment of healing for this wound in our national history. What was the church's response? The difficulty is not all the dioceses in the country or religious orders ran schools, right? And the church is decentralized. So Pope Benedict decided in 2009 to receive a delegation of Indigenous leaders at the Vatican, and he apologized then, 2009. So we've had all of that. Then we had a commission that reported in 2015. It's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You're going to hear a lot about that. TRC, we call it in Canada. And they said, we acknowledge what's gone on before, but we would like the Pope to come to Canada and apologize here. To be frank, that got a little people's backs up, saying, look, we just did the apology. Why do we have to do it again? Did you not take it seriously? Whatever. So there's been a lot of back and forth. However, last year, you might have seen, our viewers might have seen some of those stories about unmarked graves, sometimes called mass graves. They weren't mass graves, but it created a lot of intensity, both in the civic society and in the church in Canada. And so now we have another attempt at reconciliation. The Pope gave a very beautiful address back in April at the Vatican to a delegation, and now he's here today. So there's 130 years of history, Kevin, in a little bit over a minute. So it's a lot, but that's what's happening. And today, it's not the first time, but the Pope is here. It's not a small thing for the Pope to make any kind of trip. It's not a small thing for this Pope at 85 with his limitations to make this long trip. And so we're here on a very historic day that is not the first step, but a very important step on this long wrestling with our legacy of residential schools in Canada.
Well, that was thank you for bringing us up to speed, because I think for most of us, especially non-Indigenous people like me, and even getting involved in this broadcast, you dive in and you start to feel very, 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 ashamed, confused, and a bit, where do we go from here? And I hope I know we will, but I hope we get somewhere today, because it really, I heard it said, it's not an us and them situation, it's an all of us situation together. And we see people, you're looking at images now from Edmonton in Maskwacis. There'll be thousands of people there, mostly survivors, as the Holy Father, Pope Francis. This was about survivors. This was about addressing the hurts and the pain and the sorrow, but also the hope, which we also hope to speak to about today. Cecil, you mentioned your mother grew up in a residential school. Is that?
She taught for 1 year in a residential school. She taught in day schools. So I mean, she's one person that I keep in mind as I speak about these things. There's a full range of stories, and it's an incredible challenge to try to make sure I leave space for all those different stories, from some horrific stories that I've heard from people close to me, or that I know about, having read, or through interviews I've done, to stories on the other end of the spectrum, non-Indigenous. I have a good non-Indigenous Catholic friend who was in residential school, placed there by his police officer father in the north for 3.5 years, and came face to face with a predator in a poorly run school where that predator had the run of the way. He had access to all the boys, and the things that he did in that period were horrific. But this is a non-Indigenous Catholic who was there for 3.5 years. So you can imagine what it was like for kids if their parents didn't place them freely in the school, but were taken away, put in that school at age 5, and then left at age 16, right? So one predator in a poorly managed school. Now, I wanted to go back to what the oblate apology, and I'm glad you pointed that out. It wasn't just for these kinds of things that happen in the school, but they said for the existence of the schools themselves, right? And that, it's not to say that the intentions of educating and helping Indigenous peoples to adapt were illegitimate ones. And if only those had been the primary ones, and if only Indigenous people had been really very much involved right from the start. You mentioned that, the residential school policy came from the government, but obviously it was humanitarian and religious groups that started off many of these schools, and then they were sort of drawn into this program, some of them willingly, some of them with resistance. And we could speak a bit more about that as well. But it's, you mentioned what hope can we take from, what hope can we carry forward? I think it is a penitential pilgrimage, and while it is exceptional, to frame an entire papal visit around that theme, for Catholics, we know, every Mass begins with a penitential rite. So, we've received this call to the gospel, and in our lives and in our cultures, there's a constant call to conversion. And what happens when we let that go our culture ends up converting our faith and watering it down. And that's ultimately, in many ways, what happened. The worst of what happened in residential schools went contrary to Catholic social teaching. Right, so that's
when we leave the church, when we lose that essence of the church's teaching, when we get away. I think Bishop Scott McKay spoke. We get into trouble when we start marrying ourselves with the latest cultural. We got to stay true to the gospel. We got to stay true to the gospel, and that's why the Holy Father is visiting today. That one-on-one encounter, that idea of compassion, that idea of walking with people through these emotions, some of which are many, many years old. Father, he's going to visit a grave today. Is this a disputed grave? What can we?
No, we're looking there at the grave, the cemetery at Maskwacis. So just the location where he's going today is a place where there's actually several Indigenous groups that share that area. And on that site, why that site was chosen, practically they had to find a place where the Pope could get to without a long drive, because you can't stay in the car very long. It's close to Edmonton. The largest residential school in the country was there on this site. It's been torn down. It doesn't exist anymore. But the largest residential school was there. And one of the painful episodes of the residential schools is that they weren't, I mean, first of all, sanitation and healthcare and nutrition were not great in remote areas back in 1910 or 1940. But there were children who died in the schools. It's very important to realize, because there's a lot of bad reporting last year. There were no massacres in the schools. There were no murders in the schools. There were not children thrown into mass graves. There were children who died in the schools, usually due to disease, and probably, we would be, I think, safe to assume, because of neglect. Maybe that the government didn't provide enough funding. Because remember, these were government-funded schools, and part of the challenge for the church is when you get too close to the government, bad things happen. But this cemetery, the Pope is going to stop there. It's just a regular cemetery for that area. So we can assume that some of the children who went to that school, who may have died in the school, either just natural causes or through negligence or neglect, may have been buried there. The wisdom of choosing this site is because last year, when that story blew up all around the world, that there were mass graves in Canada, children had been massacred, it created a lot of ill will and a lot of confusion and a lot of pain on behalf of the Indigenous community and others. A year later, now we've got controversy at those sites because they haven't really been fully investigated. So better to honor the dead in a cemetery where likely some students who went to that school were there, buried there, but without any of the controversy. So that's why he's chosen to visit this site here.
Well, thank you for the clarification on that, because we were inundated, and it seemed like you couldn't open the paper last year without, like, trying to make sense of this is very, very difficult. And to get that clarity is so important. And hopefully some of that clarity is going to come through today when the Holy Father speaks, which we're going to hear live from Edmonton. We just saw some of the papal motorcade coming into Maskwacis. So we'll wait and we'll see when that happens and follow things as they come along. I'd like to
add, Kevin, just when we're looking at these pictures, so the Pope's only going to a few places,
yes,
given his limitations. So there are Indigenous Canadians from all over Western Canada. The residential schools were mostly in the western part of our country, mostly. So there are residential school former students and families from all over Western Canada who've come there, some at long distance. So the people we're seeing here are not just from the Maskwacis Reserve, but from right across the country.
Thousands of survivors, I understand.
I think there's about 15,000 who are there. Some of them went to the schools themselves, and some are from families, where their parents or grandparents went. And the chief who's going to be welcoming the Pope, Chief Wilton Littlechild, himself went to the residential school that was formerly on that site. So he's actually from there.
And he'll be giving the opening greeting
He'll be the
before
opening.
the Pope
Yeah,
gives
he's
his
the official welcomer. He's a very distinguished, he was a member of Parliament here across the way for a while. He's worked at the United Nations. That Truth and Reconciliation Commission I talked about, which was so important in how these issues are framed in Canada today, he was one of the 3 commissioners. So his name is Wilton Littlechild, very well respected. But he was the chief of that, of what used to be called Hobima, now it's called Maskwacis. He was the chief there. He lives there. His office is there. I was there. I sat with him for 2 hours just about 2 months ago, getting ready for this out in Maskwacis.
What was your take on one-on-one?
He's a man who really seeks reconciliation. One of the things we're going to see throughout the week is that not everybody does. He really does. And he's really an elder with the wisdom of many years. And he's worked very hard on this issue. And I don't think, well, it's not accidental that in God's providence, but also in the planning of logistical people, that Chief Littlechild is going to be center stage today, because he's one of the real, you want to say, giants of the reconciliation process.
Cecil, you teach on this subject, on this topic. You know, there's a lot of head, obviously, in this subject. There's a lot of, you know, just facts and figures and you know, as Father pointed out, such a long history, but there's also the heart. You know, how do you balance the heart and the head as you speak about this subject to your students?
Well, it's tremendously challenging, and it's especially for people who have been deeply hurt, who have a tremendous degree of anger and are suffering because of what's happened to them directly or to their parents, or grandparents. It's an intergenerational thing as well. So there's a lot of hurt there. There's also many non-Indigenous who are trying to find a way, in some ways, to appropriate, integrate this, and in some ways maybe also avoid bearing that burden. So you also have the phenomenon, in all cases like this, of trying to find some way to be maybe more on the right side of history, so to speak, finding a scapegoat. You have all those issues of the gaps that can arise between what actually happened and the perceptions and misperceptions. And that can happen. I'm not saying that, I'm saying this from all angles here, right? So you've got one thing that Catholics shouldn't do is just simply say, well, there's scapegoating, there's this and that going on, therefore it's, you can be reduced to that, right? No, there is, the TRC gave a very, very detailed report. It's substantial.
TRC,
the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we know the broad lines. Now, the important point that I'm trying to make is that those broad lines are there. We can't reduce it to its simple summary and then avoid and neglect all the nuances and the exceptions, because those stories are what humanize people. Because the challenge here is not just to understand that there were cases of abuse, but how do you understand that good people went along with things that were, that's the struggle that many Catholics are facing. And so there's a little bit more context I could give to this, which goes back to the point of hope.
Yeah, but we're going to talk
but
about
let's
that.
come back to that a little bit later.
We'll do that after, because we do, if we're not people of hope, St. Paul says, then who are we, right? So we will speak about the hope aspect of this and where we can move forward after this historic address by our Holy Father, which is going to happen in about 6 minutes' time. At least things will start to head underway. Father, what can we expect the Holy Father to say today? What do you think he needs to say today?
Well, it's not really, if I put it a little bit provocatively, it doesn't matter what he says, it's where he's saying it. Because on April the 1st, not even 4 months ago, he gave a very beautiful, sincere, comprehensive, and lyrical apology in Rome. So he's going to use a different image. He's going to repeat the same thing 4 times this week. But what he says will not be any different than what he said in April. If you want to know what the papal apology sound like, already been done. The significance is where he's doing it, because for the Indigenous peoples, their land is very important. It's tied up with their culture and their history, so that he's come to their place, to their home, to their land. That's the great significance. But he's going to apologize for the participation of Christians in those schools, the abuses that took place there, the attempts to make a culture seem inferior or to make it seem, something to be ashamed of. He's going to apologize for all of that, but he's not going to apologize for the gospel. He's not going to apologize for the fact that every culture is enriched with the gospel. What he said very clearly in Rome was that the gospel of Jesus Christ, cannot be proposed by methods contrary to the gospel. And he's going to make that distinction there today in a place that's very historic. So the words are going to be very beautiful, but they're sort of secondary to where he's saying it, because he said that back in April. And I just make one last point. As Cecil talks about the Catholic Church, how do we respond? One of the realities of the Catholic Church in Canada today is it's not an Irish and French Catholic Church anymore. The Irish and French parts of the church are mostly dead in the country. The living parts of the church in Canada are Vietnamese, Filipino, South Indian, people who've come from very hard backgrounds sometimes and arrived here long after the first residential schools were in the past. So it's a kind of a listening experience for a lot of Catholics because this was not their history. And Cecil points out how complicated history is. Imagine how complicated it is if you arrived in Canada after the last residential school was closed. So that's another challenge here, is that this is going to be, for Catholics today, you point out our shepherds there, we're going to see elderly Irish and French Canadian cardinals. That's the past of the church in Canada. There's not going to be any elderly Irish and French Canadian cardinals in the future because that part of the church is passing away. So it's a challenge for new Canadian Catholics to understand the history, painful history, complicated history, also holy history of the church in Canada.
Cecil, before we head over to Edmonton for live coverage of the events that will unfold there at Maskwacis, let's talk very briefly about unity amongst First Nations people. Is there, Father mentioned it earlier, not everybody is accepting, what's happening here or wants to accept an apology. Can you speak to the unity or the disunity, discord, and how do we reconcile that moving forward? This is a long process.
Well, I mean, Catholics are very familiar with the disunity within the church, right? So I think that would be, it's nothing, it shouldn't be any surprise. I think that there's a lack of unity. One point about journeys of healing and reconciliation is that we can't assume that this is something you kind of check off, it gets done, right? In earlier conversations I've pointed out, there are people that are going to be born in the next 5-10 years who have to figure out why it is that their families and their communities are so troubled. And they have to figure out how much of this is on us and how much of it is on residential schools, colonialism, etc. They are going to learn about that, learn about these sources, and they have to embark on their own journey of healing and reconciliation. So this is not something that just gets finished. If you look at Phil Fontaine, 1990, he shares this story and of abuse in the schools publicly. And it was 2011, he was an honorary witness at the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, national event in Halifax, and he spoke about how, having gone into the archives, having seen a lot more of the nuance and the details, having met with many religious sisters in sharing circles, having worked with the bishops, having gone to Rome, right after, well over a decade here, he's sharing how he painted he was basically saying, I painted everybody with a black brush. Yet so many of the people, most of the people who worked in these schools were good people working in a fundamentally flawed system. That's 2 decades, right? So not everybody's going to make this journey at the same pace or at the same time. And that's a really important point. But I think fundamentally the hope that the Pope is going to, that our Holy Father is going to bring here is a public acknowledgement that so many of the troubles that Indigenous communities and families face are not, it's not their burden to bear alone, and that the church has a deep responsibility in this and wants to walk with Indigenous people. So that opens up a tremendous amount of hope for people who've long been told that your situation is your fault. It's because of this. And you go back to the racist ideologies of the 19th century, which have continued in varying ways, maybe more subtle, into the 20th and 21st century. We do, that's placed a tremendous burden on people. They've been told, you're not worth, you have little to bring. And so to the enrichment of the gospel, of each culture, there's also each culture's enrichment of our reception of the gospel. And Pope Benedict XVI made that point in Truth and Tolerance, one of his great works, that the the non-Christian culture in the encounter with the gospel has something to teach us about our own faith as well. And I think that that's very much in sync with Catholic social teaching. And
one of the things, though, just to, Cecil spoke very well about Phil Fontaine, a key figure. He was 3 times the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, the most prominent chief in the country. The current chief has no interest in this.
Interesting.
The current chief refused to go to Rome with that huge delegation in April. Phil Fontaine was there, a former chief. Chief Littlechild was there. The current national chief, Roseanne d'Archibald, refused even to go. She's been complaining ever since that she's not been consulted. Of course she wasn't consulted. She refused to go when she was there for a week. So in terms of the division and disunity, it's very, very deep in the Indigenous communities. We have very respected elders like Chief Fontaine, Chief Littlechild, who are going to be prominent here. We have a lot of Indigenous people in their own local communities, very engaged in the life of the church and reconciliation. We're going to see that this evening at Sacred Heart Church in Edmonton. But in the political leadership of the Indigenous communities in the country, led by the current national chief, things are very bleak at the moment, actually. So there isn't a partner for reconciliation amongst some of those. There are lots of partners for reconciliation, but that's going to be one of the challenging things. And if you saw the comments that the current national chief has been making since April when she refused to go, she wasn't there to hear that apology, right? She wasn't there. So we've got, there are challenges here that this week are going to be in the bit of the background. But they're there, and it's going to be a bit of a long slog to try and get that current political leadership in the country interested again in what their predecessors were, as Cecil pointed out 10 years ago.
Well, and I don't think we should give up hope that people will come to that space. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of anger. And hurt. And, it's often said there can be no reconciliation without truth. And sometimes those who have offended have been far too slow. I fully acknowledge the oblate apology, but others within the church and others within the public have been slow to acknowledge those things. So there's a challenge there, and so around achieving reconciliation without truth. But there's also the challenge of how do you get at truth without a spirit of reconciliation, right? So you just think of a couple going through a divorce and how stories, they're not necessarily going to be very nuanced in the midst of that, right? And I'm not comparing this to a divorce here or beyond the point that in that context it's
they're not talking, Cecil. I mean, we have to be very frank. I mean, the national chief was not there in Rome to hear. She was invited to go. She refused to go. Yes. And we will see in about an hour and a half, the national chief will come out and she will say that what the Holy Father said was inadequate or insufficient or that she wasn't consulted. We know that. So there's a political game that's going to go. We're going to hear that, and our viewers, when they find news from other sources, are going to find that political game. That's not the game the Holy Father is playing today. And he has lots of partners. Chief Littlechild is one of them. But this is going to be factored, this pilgrimage, it's a pilgrimage, it's going to be prayer, it's going to be repentance. It's going to be fractured or seen through the prism of some of the political intransigence that we see in the country today, which doesn't represent, Indigenous Canadians are not some sort of special species. Their political leaders are divided, their political leaders have their own personal agenda, and what we're going to see today is actually, in a way, the last step of the generation that's been at this since 1990. The new generation may not be as interested.
No reconciliation without truth, no redemption without shame. And I think that is what many of us are feeling today as Catholics, as Christians, that shame. And we look to the Holy Father. I look to the Holy Father for that witness, that Christ-like witness of accepting that shame so that I can come to some redemption. Even though, many of us weren't personally involved in this, I think as a church we feel that sense of sorrow, and trying to place it somewhere, trying to put it somewhere is so important. And I think for all of us, this pilgrimage today is so important, I mean, I found myself yesterday, just getting emotional. And I don't mean to be over dramatic. I mean, this really hurts as a Catholic. Where do we put that, Father? Where do we go with this? And how? And will this help us today?
Well, it will. First of all, part of the emotion of yesterday was, whatever the reason is, it's always a grace to have the Holy Father in your country.
Yes.
We're used to popes traveling around, but it doesn't actually happen that often. And when you see the Pope in your own country, as a Catholic, that's a blessing. That's a grace, regardless. And when you see him physically weak, we saw him come down the elevator or the lift from the plane. Remember, 20 years ago, John Paul walked down those steps. Everybody was crying at the end of it that he made that effort. So that's a grace. To the question of shame, the Holy Father said in April in Rome, when I look at these history, I feel indignation and shame. Those were the two words he used, indignation and shame. Indignation for what was done, and shame for the fact that it was people acting in the name of the gospel who did it, even though they betrayed the gospel when they did those abuses. So he spoke about that. He's going to speak about it again. The challenge of healing the past comes when you don't have redemption. And the Holy Father is going to say today, he's going to stop in that cemetery, and he is going to, as a Christian witness, say that the answer to a grave and the answer to all graves is the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, which is to say he's going to put the basic Christian proclamation of Christ is risen as the answer to this particular episode of shame and indignation and disgrace and dishonor. So he's going to visit that grave, and then he's going to tell, in his speech today, he's going to speak about the resurrection of the Lord Jesus being the answer to the grave. So what is the answer for Catholics who see that our own fellow believers have betrayed the gospel? It can't be to abandon the gospel. It has to go back to the gospel.
But that's happening. I know friends who have left the church because of this issue. I don't know where to put it. I don't know where to begin that conversation with them. And I think there are many people watching today who probably feel the same way.
Well, if you go to the sexual abuse crisis within the church, and we all know that this was widespread. It is widespread in society, right? But the church, you would expect, would uphold better standards. What was the source of greater scandal was perhaps the way these things were handled or mishandled, right? It was the shifting around of perpetrators rather than the perpetrators themselves that was more scandalous. And I think that's the challenge. And going back to the national chief, knowing where she's coming from and where her people are at in terms of the anger is also important to understand where she's. I will never give up hope that she will be a partner going forward in this. And I want to wait and see what she has to say about this. But it is tremendously challenging. I mean, I could share a lot of stories. I've had conversations over the last year with friends in the Cree community where I'm from, and it is extremely difficult. My starting point, and this is the starting point I would recommend to many, especially coming at this, is just to imagine yourself as a parent having your child taken away, put into a school, losing the capacity to speak to them in the same language. Let's say you've got 3 children. One, you lose the capacity to speak to them in the same language. Another one is abused. Another one dies of neglect. You don't see them for 10, 12 years. and they come out of that not knowing how to parent. And just imagine dealing with that, or imagine you went through residential school and have suffered abuse and have to figure out, well, the dysfunctionality in my family, the hurt that I caused my children, how much of that is on me and how much of that is on the abuse that these are tremendously difficult things for people to grapple with. Sure. And so I think that our first stance, and I think what we're seeing from the Holy Father, is to speak not to the people who may be using this for political aims or whatever it might be out there, but to speak to those who are suffering and who are looking for the Holy Father to acknowledge that deep hurt, and in many ways to open that door to hope and to reconciliation. And that message of the gospel is going to resonate with many of the people here are Indigenous Catholics. Many Indigenous people in Canada are people of the Christian faith, right? So many of them are challenged, right, in this context to integrate these things. Others are not. They see it as very much, this is, in spite of everything, it's my faith that I go to, and I can tell you the story of.
We do see the Holy Father here.
He's just arriving.
This is our first glimpse of the whole. Thank you, Cecil. This is our first glimpse of the Holy Father on this Monday. We're watching live coverage of the Pope's historic visit to Canada on EWTN. You see the Pope there in a wheelchair as delegates and traditional drumming going on to welcome the Holy Father.
So this is Jerry Saddleback. He's from that territory. He's giving the ceremonial welcome. The Pope, it's about an hour south if you drive from Edmonton. The Pope, people motorcades make that distance a little bit more quickly than I did a couple months ago, but it's about an hour south. And he's going to be greeted, but the traditional greetings when important visitors come to that territory there at Maskwacis. And then he'll have some stops that he'll make. He may tour the area in the Popemobile or in a golf cart. He'll decide depending on how he feels when he gets there. And then he'll be taken to the former residential school site, which is now a new school built there, and he'll be taken to the cemetery site. And then when he arrives and where he's going to sort of be formally received, there'll be another set of Indigenous greetings, and then the address of welcome that we already discussed by Chief Wilton Littlechild there.
And normally we see the Holy Father in a Popemobile. He's, again, one-on-one, in a wheelchair, greeting people. It's beautiful.
Now this priest here that she's talking to him on the screen is this is an Indian priest from India who has come to work amongst Indigenous Canadians for the last 15 years or so. And it's an example of this new reality of the church in our country. Cecil made an excellent point as we watched the Holy Father perhaps praying here, I'm not sure, or just gesturing, is that the majority of Indigenous people in Canada are Christians, and the majority of the Christians are Catholics. So this is not a kind of a process where the church is talking to people outside of herself. This is healing a wound inside the church. And one of the aspects of this that we'll see this afternoon a little bit more clearly at that church, Catholic parish of the First Peoples, is that this is a matter of reconciliation within the church. It's not sort of something outside of the church.
And another point on that, there's the majority of Indigenous people still identify as Christian, most of them Catholic. And that's not because of the imposition of residential schools, but really
they're believers.
Well,
they're believers.
Yes, I'm not using that term with all the connotations that we have right now, but they see themselves. They are Catholics. They're Christians, many of them. But the point is not because it was imposed in residential schools, but more often the case in spite of it. So you take the example of Honorable Graydon Nicholas, the first Indigenous lawyer, judge, and lieutenant governor in the Atlantic region, Supreme Warden of the Knights of Columbus. a devout Catholic who's been very much involved with this, in the planning of this, and he laments the impact of residential schools on the Catholic faith that his people had shared since the baptism of Grand Chief Member II in 1610. So many of the people who retain the faith and retain an appreciation and respect for the churches in spite of that. Right? So,
It's a very profound moment here. Obviously, the Pope is praying for those who have suffered and died, reflecting on the stories he heard from survivors in Rome, and to pray not just for those lost, but those who continue to experience intergenerational trauma and suffering from their families and their loved ones. During this time of prayer, the drumming falls silent. We'll just spend a moment here. We are just steps away from the former Ermineskin School, residential school, one of the largest in Canada. This is Edmonton, Alberta. The site is remembered by the presence of 5 teepees, 4 of them representing each of the nations of this land. And the 5th teepee serving as a symbol of the entrance to the school that once stood. In its place is now a teepee. We saw those earlier as the Holy Father made his way in. Obviously, very profound moment for the Holy Father, as it was during the visit earlier this year. Later this week, Father Henry Sands will be with us. He was one of the delegates during that visit, and it really was those stories, wasn't it, Father, that compelled him to make that decision to come?
Yes, well, in fairness, he said last fall he was going to come long before the delegation arrived. But that was a very profound moment for him. That delegation, by the way, only got there this year, but it was planned before COVID, actually. So this was all in process. That's why it's good to know the history. They were planned before even the discovery of the graves last year. But he was very moved by what he heard. He spent 4 hours with those groups, which is very unusual in the papal schedule, over the course of a week, and he spoke about that. And then he said at the end of that, I've heard your stories, I want to visit you where you are. And so he's kept that promise today, and they took him to the cemetery there, and now he'll make his way into the, if you want to say, the main area where the village is, where the school is, was, and the new school is, and then he'll be welcomed more formally by the Indigenous host. What you're seeing here mostly is the papal security team, and behind him there is Archbishop Richard Smith. You can see him obviously dressed as an archbishop. He's the coordinator of the papal visit to Canada and the Archbishop of Edmonton. And then soon enough he'll be greeted, as you can see, it's a bit of a distance from the cemetery into the village, and shortly to be greeted formally by his Indigenous host there.
Yes, and Archbishop Smith and the former Commissioner Wilton Littlechild had a wonderful conversation last year in the midst of all that was coming out in the media that I think is worth going to and watching. It's on the Archdiocese of Edmonton website. You can find a conversation on reconciliation in the midst of that challenging time.
So we're looking at pictures of the site. It's remembered by the presence of 5 teepees, as I mentioned just earlier. Each of the nations of this land: Louis Bull, Samson, Montana, and Ermineskin. And this 5th teepee serving as a symbol of the entrance to the school that once stood. Ermineskin residential school. Alberta being the site of the, or the home of most of the residential schools. That's why this location is so important.
Your worship, on the first street, hit the
Holy Father being greeted by some Indigenous delegates. Always a smile, eh, Father?
Yes, he's kind of enlivened, I think, despite the physical difficulties when he gets to meet people. And he's going to get the symbolism here is they greet you when you arrive at the land. Now, if he was a little bit more physically able, they could do it a little bit differently, but they've done it this way very simply with him in the wheelchair. And then he will go into the actual village where there'll be the more ceremonial entrance. But the idea is when you come to the edge of the land, you're given a welcome. And he will now continue on. They have the cart and the Popemobile available, depending on what he wants to do, or they can just push him in the wheelchair, which is what they've chosen so far. You can see in the background is the car, and then there's some also golf carts there. And you know, on a bit of a lighter note, he might have taken a tip from Pope Benedict Emeritus, because that's how he gets around up at the Vatican Gardens, is in a papal golf cart. He's not really able to walk anymore either. So,
You're watching live coverage of the Holy Father Pope Francis' historic visit to Canada. This is live coverage from Edmonton, Alberta, home of residential schools. And this one particular residential school, Hermanskin Residential School, the site where it once stood. The Holy Father taking a moment to reflect. And this is something we'll see repeatedly over the next few days, elements that remind us all of the resilience of the Indigenous people and their culture. This has remained endured despite the tragedy and suffering they faced, their culture and traditions being stripped away many times.
There's a story that was told by one residential school survivor, actually for the first time publicly at the Rimini meetings in Italy. He had plans to speak about something else, and on his way up to the stage shared his story of being abused by one priest in a residential school, and then having another priest show up just as he was about to take his life and save his life. And that priest told him, go back to the ways of your grandparents. And it was through that he also came back to the Catholic faith as well that his grandparents had embraced. And you know, there are so many stories like that. Michael O'Brien, when he gave his honorary witness statement, this is a non-Indigenous Catholic author, artist who attended residential school for 3.5 years. He turned around and he spoke to the people. He said, you are Canada's jewel, spiritual jewel. He saw in them a tremendous capacity for forgiveness and love and a desire to move forward. And it was, he was deeply moved by that more than by anything that he saw, including coming back and seeing other students that he hadn't seen in 50 years. So
we're now going to move over to our friends in Edmonton, who are giving commentary on the events that will transpire. So we'll let them take it away, and we will join you either during this program or after for commentary. So please stay tuned for this historic visit that you're watching here on EWTN, live from Ottawa, here in our studio in Edmonton, which we go to right now.
Respect shown for your identity, your culture, and even your spiritual values. Father in his wheelchair riding in silence, flanked by the four chiefs of the four nations. that we saw earlier have been able to watch our Holy Father's movements through large screens. The motorcade now moving toward the arbor. We see it just off to the right of our screens. When our Holy Father enters, he will be coming in through the south entrance. Directions are very, very important to the Indigenous cultures. And once he himself is seated on the stage, we will also witness with him the entrance of, or the grand entry of the chiefs is what it's called. There are many other chiefs who will be participating in this meeting today. There are also many members of Canadian government here as well, senators and elected members of Parliament. The Minister of Indigenous Services should also be in attendance, as well as the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. Father in his wheelchair, he did cancel a trip that was scheduled at the beginning of July to the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan due to an injury to his knee. The last apostolic journey our Holy Father made abroad was to Malta on April 2nd and 3rd. That was just a day after he received the delegation of the Indigenous peoples of Canada in Rome. Pope Francis remembered the World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly yesterday on his flight from Rome. It would have been the second time, or it's the second time that the World Day has been celebrated since he established it on the fourth Sunday of July. And he said on the plane, just before reciting the Angelus, he said, "Today we need to go back to grandparents." I would say so as a leitmotif, in the sense that young people must have contact with their grandparents, going back to them, going back to their roots, not to stay there. No, but to take them forward like the tree, which takes strength from the roots and carries it forward in the flowers and in the fruit. He emphasized how grandparents are responsible for the blossoming and maturing future generations, and they need to be respected. He also said, "I would also like to remember, as a religious, the old men and women religious, the grandparents of consecrated life." He said, "Please do not hide them. They are the wisdom of a religious family." And that the new men and women religious, the novices, we have to have contact with them so that they will give us the experience of life that will help us to move forward. He also thanked all the journalists accompanying him and reminded them that this journey is a bit different. It needs special attention, and a special spirit must be dedicated to this apostolic journey, since it is a penitential pilgrimage in which the Pope himself wants to show closeness to the Indigenous people who have suffered. We now see the 4 chiefs who were accompanying the Holy Father just through the opening there in the back. Here we see the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And the chief we see in front of us, George Arcand, the Grand Chief of the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations.
We'll have the holiness, get comfortable up there. Get comfortable up there.
This here is the Governor General, Mary Simon. Here we see a good aerial view of what is called the arbor. It's the round circle. It's also a typical where powwows are held. Our Holy Father now has climbed the stairs to the stage. He now has a cane in hand. We see the logo behind, walking together.
Hey. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, our drum song, the drum, and all our drums right across Turtle Island. It is a symbol of the heartbeat of Mother Earth. It's a symbol of the heartbeat of each and every one of us. We have a heartbeat. It represents the heartbeat of all animals and living things. So it is very powerful. It's healing. And again, it is a very special afternoon to be able to witness this and have this very sacred song introduce our visitor. So at this time, we're going to go into what we call a grand entry. We're going to be honoring our chiefs. They will be coming in from the east side will be our current chiefs, and to the south will be our former chiefs. So at this time, we're going to go into a grand entry song, what we call a grand entry song. Aha. Singers, Nigabuk. Hiya. Ladies and gentlemen, our chiefs, every nation has an eagle staff. We have our eagle staffs leading our grand entry procession. The eagle staff represents our sovereignty. Our nations are represented by the eagle staffs. The history of our nations are represented with our eagle staffs. At this time, we're going to be coming in and calling in our great chiefs wearing the war bonnets. Our war bonnets are very sacred to us. War bonnets represent leadership of our nation, leadership amongst all our nations. The war bonnet, the eagle bonnet, represents who we are as a nation. So right here we got our Four Nations chiefs coming in at this time. Again, welcome to Maskwacis. We have our four chiefs, our Four Nations chiefs, and also our Grand Chief, Dr. Wilton Littlechild. So ladies and gentlemen, on this side, Sagastedok. Sagastedok is the east. The east represents the sun. The sun gives us light. The sun gives us health. The sun is one of the most powerful things the Creator has given us. As people, as First Nations people, we acknowledge the sun for healing and health. Yeah. So right now we have our former chiefs. We also have represented here, we have all our chiefs within our territory, Treaty 6 territory, and also visiting chiefs from other First Nations in the war bonnets. Tapos mga higo get nice kamig. Tapos higo magisigaw. Tapos kakisiya. Hego tahanma. Halma mihtatamuin. Hego ma. Hego tse. Hego ma kapmise. Gawi mais spike. Tapos tapngasiya pingo ek. Takiam. Tapone tamik. Tapone tamak. Helma kiano tatsesun. Niga nimia. Hey tawase ao kiam. Halma kipmatsuin no ay suniga nimia. Kitawasim sinawag. Mina kakyo ko simnog. Minangge kape no gustik. Hey kotakiam tapmohtin getsik. Halma kigoy. Tagagito kagotsik. Hey! Hey! Penatavok matsuin! Penatavok! Halma! Hey, tabisikagito kagwik! Hey, kota, huyate wasuin! Yama tsehuin! Hey, soniganimia! Kakiam! Halma! Kainay siniuya! Kiam, tapone, taba! Kiam ego, mesos digaras kamga. Heo go kiam, takat staunena no. Hey, wetna kaya win. Trebaga tibagna ko ya kota ilok sebanto. Hanmok sewat suen.
We continue to see various highly decorated people coming in, some carrying banners representing the nations they represent. And here we see banners. This could be the memorial banner that we heard about with the names of children who died in the residential schools. Our Holy Father did stop before this banner that was placed at the church that he visited earlier before arriving here, Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows. Those carrying this banner, it's quite long, it's wound around them. Beautiful way of making present if the children who went to these residential schools, of course, as we know in our Christian faith in some way, are still present. In God, as we remember them here on earth. Here we see the eagle staffs that were described at the beginning. And the drummers continuing to perform the grand entry song.
Hey, 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 hey. Maybe at this time, ladies and gentlemen, let's give everybody a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, over here, we have our Ogimawak. We also have our eagle staffs. The eagle staffs represent our warriors. We have to defend our territories. Our warriors had to defend the language. Our warriors had to defend our children, our grandchildren. We had to defend our language. We had to defend our way of life. So these eagle staff represent that, and also the war bonnets. They represent leadership. So at this time, we're going to honor our eagle staffs and the war bonnets, our chiefs, with the flag song.
Actually, you know what? Forget this. It doesn't get in the table. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. We'll go before we do it.
Hi, hi, hi. Thank you very much there, singers. I'm going to ask you to sing one more song. Can you have the victory song there, singers? Sing us the victory song as we honor. You know, we've been here since time immemorial, and it's 2022, and we still have our way of life. We still have our languages, and we're going to continue on living our way of life. It's only going to get better. This is what we call our victory song, and here at this time, we'll have our Eagle Staffs, our chiefs. Name them. Sagwek warriors, where's your war call? Once again, warriors, let's hear your war call in celebration. Sagwek! Sagwek! One more time! Sagwek! Hi. Okay, gentlemen, you can post the Eagle Staffs there. We have areas that we're going to post our Eagle Staffs, and we'll have all our chiefs come back here. We're going to go into a healing dance here at this time, as soon as we have our Eagle Staff situated right around the center pole here. You know, circle, it represents life from the beginning, and it never ends. We're going to continue that journey. So again, the center pole, we have one of our biggest ceremonies where we have what we call the king tree stands in the middle of our lodge, and all of our nation's people come there to show the Creator. And you know, they have to go through a 3-day, 4-day fast where they're going to dance without food and water. But this arbor you see, he represents that lodge. And again, gentlemen, you can make your way up to the front. And all the dignitaries, there is seating in front for you all. Hi.
We now see the various chiefs coming up to take their place on the stage with the Holy Father. The chiefs representing the 4 local nations: the Louisbourg, Samson, Montana, and Ermineskin. The logo in the back flanking the backdrop behind us. We see once again this memorial banner winding its way through the arbor here. And someone is shouting all the children, all the names who attended our residential schools. My mom mattered. So they're bearing this banner throughout those here present, and it winds its way out of one of the exits here.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a lot of survivors here, and this is a very historic event, and they wanted to be here. And we're asking everybody if you could just be seated, please, ladies and gentlemen, because people want to watch. I know we have the big screens out there, but we do really want to watch him as he makes his and what he's going to talk about here. Quick. Okay, quickly, everybody, you can clear the area.
We're seeing some people here sitting on the grass now as people begin to take their seats.
Here, warriors, veterans, they're missing their chairs. Is somebody going to help them out? And everybody make a nice circle. We have people inside the circle. Kind of back up, back up. Everyone, back up.
As the camera pans the crowd, we're able to see some of the beadwork that many of these nations are famous for. Here we can see some on the headdresses. And here we see an up-close image of the banner, actually reading some of the names.
An mokse wat suin kia tapune tama chik tapune tama chik elgan matapue magam suite oche tapue ga petagote mstahe nanas komptinan tapue maga kakiwe tama suna wa takiwe tama suna wa mamo skiu mat suin Ekta kiam ka kio tipa hoa nigo. Kap mohtin geek. Iteo tiga pepa sigoeg. Iteo tskotemieg. Binekta tahtoga penakataegok. Kinakataga nuaog. Kawigiwe tamaog. Wow, kan maya. Kigo e miasik. Uhuyots mamo taima. Se manto, se wat suit. So ladies and gentlemen, at this time we're going to go to our sacred drum here with our singers. They're going to sing a special song again, and this is what we are going to be calling the healing dance. They'll sing the healing song, and we're going to have our dancers dance within this circle. And this will be all about healing, and the drum is a big part of the healing. It's the heartbeat of Mother Earth. The drum is life. Keep on walking, keep on walking, keep on walking there. Keep on walking. And security, if you want to kneel down up to the side so people can watch. You know, ladies and gentlemen, the number 4 represents the elements, the 4 directions, the 4 stages of life, the four living life forms. 4 directions. We have the sun rising from the east. And we also have, from the south, we have the Thunderbird. And over on the west side, we have the wind, the oxygen that we breathe. This is the government of Mother Earth. And on the north side, we have Mother Earth. Mother Earth is who we are. Mother Earth is all the plant life. Mother Earth, our mother, is also the mother of all insect life. Mother Earth is also the mother of all animals on the ground, in the water, in the air. Mother Earth, of course, is the mother of all humanity. Mother Earth is who she is. We are the children. We are the people of Mother Earth. Hi, hi.
For those joining through radio, we see highly decorated, beautifully dressed dancers, some men, some women.
Find a place out there, and we're gonna go next in our program here.
Your Holiness, Fancy Wapikihu, White Eagle.
And this is
It's a great honor.
Chief
to
Littlefield,
welcome
Little
you
Child,
among
excuse
us.
me.
You have traveled a long way to be with us on our land. and to walk with us on the path of reconciliation. For this, we honor you and extend to you our most heartfelt welcome. We wish to acknowledge with deep appreciation and gratitude the great personal effort you have made to travel to our land. It is a blessing to receive and host you among us. The vast expanse of land called Kaganatak, Canada, and which the Indigenous peoples refer to as part of Turtle Island, is the traditional homeland for the First Nation, Metis, and Inuit peoples. Here in Maskwacis, we are on Treaty 6 land, the ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux peoples since time immemorial. My name in Cree is Mahigant Moteo, Wolfwalker, Golden Eagle. In English, I am known as Wilton Littlechild. I was a student here at the Ermineskin Indian Residential School, which for your visit among us this day represents all the residential schools in our country. Gathered here this morning with the peoples of Maskwacis, our residential school survivors, chiefs, leaders, elders, knowledge keepers, and youth from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities across our land. We feel particularly honored to welcome as well the Governor General of Canada, Her Excellency Mary Simon, and the Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Justin Trudeau. As a former commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I have heard nearly 7,000 testimonies from former students of residential schools in this country. During the recent visit to your home at the Vatican by a delegation of Indigenous survivors, elders, knowledge keepers, and youth, you also heard of the abuses so many of us have suffered at this and other residential schools. During our time with you, it was clear to us all that you listened deeply and with great compassion to the testimonies that told of the way our languages were suppressed, our culture taken from us, and our spirituality denigrated. You have heard the devastation that followed from the way our families were torn apart. The words you spoke to us in response clearly came from the depths of your heart and were, for those who heard them, a source of deep comfort and great encouragement. On that occasion, you expressed your intention to visit with us on our land, and in this way express your strong desire to be close to us. And now, Your Holiness, you have come to our land in response to our invitation, and as you promised. You have said that you have come as a pilgrim, seeking to walk together with us on the pathway of truth, justice, healing, reconciliation, and hope. We gladly welcome you to join us on this journey. As you acknowledged in your address to us in Rome, we Indigenous peoples strive always to consider the impact of the present events and deliberations on future generations. In that spirit, we sincerely hope that our encounter this morning and the words you share with us will echo the true healing and real hope throughout many generations to come. Kitatamhin, Your Holiness. Tawao, welcome to our land.
Of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who took part in the delegation of the Assembly of First Nations to Rome at the end of March and the beginning of April earlier this year. And now we prepare to hear the words of Pope Francis himself. Long-awaited words, as we heard in response to the invitation that he received to visit the home of the First Nations, the Metis and Inuit populations living here in Canada.
Señora Gobernadora General, señor Primer Ministro, queridos pueblos indígenas de Maskwacis y
Holy Father speaking in Spanish. Madam Governor General, Mr. Prime Minister, dear Indigenous peoples of Maskwacis and of this land of Canada, dear brothers and sisters, I have been waiting to come here and be with you. Here from this place associated with painful memories, I would like to begin what I consider a penitential pilgrimage. I have come to your native lands to tell you in person of my sorrow, to implore God's forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation, to express my closeness, and to pray with you and for you.
Madam Governor General, Mr. Prime Minister, dear Indigenous peoples of Maskwacis and of this land of Canada, dear brothers and sisters, I have been waiting to come here and be with you. Here, from this place associated with painful memories, I would like to begin what I consider a pilgrimage, a penitential pilgrimage. I have come to your native lands to tell you in person of my sorrow, to implore God's forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation, to express my closeness, and to pray with you and for you.
Recuerdo los encuentros que tuvimos en Roma hace 4 meses. En ese momento me entregaron en prenda 2 pares de mocasines, signo del sufrimiento padecido por los niños indígenas, en particular de los que lamentablemente no volvieron más a casa desde las escuelas residenciales. Me pidieron que devolviera los mocasines cuando llegara a Canadá. Los traje y lo haré al terminar estas palabras. Y quisiera inspirarme precisamente en este símbolo que en los meses pasados reavivó en mí el dolor, la indignación y la vergüenza. El recuerdo de esos niños provoca aflicción y exhorta a actuar para que todos los niños sean tratados con amor, honor y respeto. Pero esos mocasines también nos hablan de un camino, de un recorrido que deseamos hacer juntos. Caminar juntos, rezar juntos, trabajar juntos para que los sufrimientos del pasado dejen el lugar a un futuro de justicia, de sanación y de reconciliación.
I recall the meetings we had in Rome 4 months ago. At that time, I was given 2 pairs of moccasins as a sign of the suffering endured by Indigenous children, especially those who unfortunately never came back home from the residential schools. I was asked to return the moccasins when I came to Canada. I brought them, and I will do so at the end of these few words, in which I would like to reflect on this symbol, which over the past few months has kept alive my sense of sorrow, indignation, and shame. The memory of those children is indeed painful. It urges us to work to ensure that every child is treated with love, honor, and respect. At the same time, those moccasins also speak to us of a path to follow, a journey that we desire to make together. We want to walk together, to pray together, and to work together so that the sufferings of the past can lead to a future of justice, healing, and reconciliation.
Y este es el motivo por el que la primera etapa de mi peregrinación entre ustedes se lleva a cabo en esta región que ha visto desde tiempos inmemoriales la presencia de los pueblos indígenas. Es un territorio que nos habla, que nos permite hacer memoria. Hacer memoria, hermanos y hermanas. Ustedes han vivido en esta tierra durante miles de años con estilos de vida que respetaban la misma tierra heredada de las generaciones pasadas y protegida para las futuras. La trataron como un don del Creador para compartir con los demás y amar con armonía con todo lo que existe, en una viva interconexión entre todos los seres vivos. Así aprendieron a nutrir un sentido de familia y de comunidad y desarrollaron vínculos fuertes y entre las generaciones, honrando a los ancianos y cuidando de los pequeños. Cuántas buenas tradiciones y enseñanzas basadas en la atención a los otros y al amor por la verdad, en la valentía y el respeto, en la humildad, en la honestidad, en la sabiduría de vida.
That is why the first part of my pilgrimage among you takes place in this region, which from time immemorial has seen the presence of Indigenous peoples. These are lands that speak to us. They enable us to remember. To remember, brothers and sisters. You have lived on these lands for thousands of years, following ways of life that respect the earth, which you received as a legacy from past generations, and are keeping for those yet to come. You have treated it as a sign of the Creator, to be shared with others, and to be cherished in harmony with all that exists, in profound fellowship with all living beings. In this way, you learn to foster a sense of family and community, and to build solid bonds between generations, honoring your elders and caring for your little ones. A treasury of sound customs and teachings centered on concern for others, truthfulness, courage and respect, humility, honesty, and practical wisdom.
Pero si estos fueron los primeros pasos dados en estos territorios, la memoria nos lleva tristemente a los sucesivos. El lugar en el que nos encontramos hace resonar en mí un grito de dolor, un clamor sofocado que me acompañó durante estos meses. Pienso en el drama sufrido por tantos de ustedes, por sus familias, por sus comunidades, en lo que ustedes compartieron conmigo sobre los sufrimientos padecidos en las escuelas residenciales. Son traumas que en cierto modo reviven cada vez que se recuerdan y soy consciente de que también nuestro encuentro de hoy puede despertar recuerdos y heridas y que muchos de ustedes podrían sentirse mal mientras yo hablo. Pero es justo hacer memoria, porque el olvido lleva a la indiferencia. Y como se ha dicho, lo opuesto al amor no es tanto el odio, es la indiferencia. Lo opuesto a la vida no es la muerte, es la indiferencia a la vida o a la muerte. Hacer memoria de las devastadoras experiencias que ocurrieron en estas escuelas residenciales nos golpea, nos indigna, nos entristece, pero es necesario.
Yet, if those were the first steps taken in these lands, the path of remembrance leads us, sadly, to those that followed. The place where we are gathered renews within me the deep sense of pain and remorse that I have felt in these past months. I think back on the tragic situations that so many of you, your families, and your communities have known, of what you shared with me about the suffering you endured in the residential schools. These are traumas that are in some way reawakened whenever the subject comes up. I realize too that our meeting today can bring back old memories and hurts, and that many of you may feel uncomfortable even as I speak. Yet, it is right to remember, because forgetfulness leads to indifference. And as has been said, the opposite of love is not hatred, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. To remember the devastating experiences that took place in the residential schools hurts, angers, causes pain, and yet it is necessary.
Es necesario recordar cómo las políticas de asimilación y desvinculación, que también incluían el sistema de las escuelas residenciales, fueron nefastas para la gente de estas tierras. Cuando los colonos europeos llegaron aquí por primera vez, hubo una gran oportunidad de desarrollar un encuentro fecundo entre las culturas, las tradiciones y la espiritualidad. Pero en gran parte esto no sucedió. Y me vuelve a la mente lo que ustedes me contaron, de cómo las políticas de asimilación terminaron por marginar sistemáticamente a los pueblos indígenas, de cómo también por medio del sistema de escuelas residenciales sus lenguas, sus culturas fueron denigradas y suprimidas, y de cómo los niños sufrieron abusos físicos y verbales, psicológicos y espirituales, de cómo se los llevaron de sus casas cuando eran chiquitos y de cómo esto marcó de manera indeleble la relación entre padres e hijos, entre abuelos y nietos.
It is necessary to remember how the policies of assimilation and enfranchisement, which also included the residential school system, were devastating for the peoples of these lands. When the European colonists first arrived here, there was a great opportunity to bring about a fruitful encounter between cultures, traditions, and forms of spirituality. Yet, for the most part, that did not happen. Again, I think back on the stories you told, how the policies of assimilation ended up systematically marginalizing the indigenous peoples. How also, through the system of residential schools, your languages and cultures were denigrated and suppressed. how children suffered physical, verbal, psychological, and spiritual abuse, how they were taken away from their homes at a young age, and how that indelibly affected relationships between parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren.
Les agradezco por haber hecho que todo esto entrara en mi corazón, por haber expresado el peso que llevaban dentro, por haber compartido conmigo esta memoria sangrante. Y hoy estoy aquí en esta tierra que junto a una memoria antigua custodia las cicatrices de heridas todavía abiertas. Me encuentro entre ustedes porque el primer paso de esta peregrinación penitencial es el de renovar mi pedido de perdón y decirles de todo corazón que estoy profundamente dolido. Pido perdón por la manera en la que lamentablemente muchos cristianos adoptaron la mentalidad colonialista de las potencias que oprimieron a los pueblos indígenas. Estoy dolido. Pido perdón en particular por el modo en que muchos miembros de la Iglesia y de las comunidades religiosas cooperaron, también por medio de la indiferencia, en esos proyectos de destrucción cultural y asimilaron forzadas de los gobiernos de la época que finalizaron en el sistema de las escuelas residenciales.
I thank you for making me appreciate this, for telling me about the heavy burdens that you still bear, for sharing with me these bitter memories. Today, I am here in this land that, along with its ancient memories, preserves the scars of still open wounds. I am here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry. Sorry for the ways in which, regrettably, many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppress the Indigenous peoples. I am sorry. I ask forgiveness. I ask forgiveness, in particular, for the ways in which many members of the church and of religious communities cooperated, not least through their indifference in projects of cultural destruction and forced assimilation promoted by the governments of that time, which culminated in the system of residential schools.
Aunque la caridad cristiana haya estado presente y existan no pocos ejemplares de entrega por los niños, con todo, las consecuencias globales de las políticas ligadas a las escuelas residenciales han sido catastróficas. Lo que la fe cristiana nos dice es que fue un error devastador, incompatible con el Evangelio de Jesucristo. Duele saber que ese terreno compacto de valores, lengua y cultura, que confirió a sus pueblos un sentido genuino de identidad, duele saber que haya sido erosionado y que ustedes siguen pagando los efectos. Frente a este mal que indigna, la Iglesia se arrodilla ante Dios y le implora perdón por los pecados de sus hijos. Quisiera repetir con vergüenza y claridad: Pido perdón humildemente por el mal que tantos cristianos cometieron contra los pueblos indígenas.
Although Christian charity was not absent, and there were many outstanding instances of devotion and care for children, the overall effects of the policies linked to the residential schools were catastrophic. What our Christian faith tells us is that this was a disastrous error, incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is painful to think of how the firm soil of values, language, and culture that made up the authentic identity of your peoples was eroded, and that you have continued to pay the price for this. In the face of this deplorable evil, the Church kneels before God and implores His forgiveness for the sins of her children. I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously. I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the indigenous peoples.
Queridos hermanos y hermanas, Queridos hermanos y hermanas, muchos de ustedes y de sus representantes han afirmado que las disculpas no son un punto de llegada. Concuerdo perfectamente. Constituyen solo el primer paso, el punto de partida. También soy consciente que mirando hacia el pasado nunca será suficiente lo que se haga para pedir perdón y buscar reparar el daño causado, y mirando hacia el futuro nunca será poco lo que se haga para generar una cultura capaz de evitar que estas situaciones no solo no se repitan, sino que no encuentren espacios. Una parte importante de este proceso es hacer una seria búsqueda de la verdad acerca del pasado y ayudar a los supervivientes de las escuelas residenciales a realizar procesos de sanación por los traumas sufridos.
Dear brothers and sisters, many of you and your representatives have stated that begging pardon is not the end of the matter. I fully agree. That is only the first step, the starting point. I also recognize that looking to the past, no effort to beg pardon and to seek to repair the harm done will ever be sufficient. And that looking ahead to the future, no effort must be spared to create a culture able to prevent such situations from happening. An important part of this process will be to conduct a serious investigation into the facts of what took place in the past and to assist the survivors of the residential schools to experience healing from the traumas they suffered.
Rezo y espero que los cristianos y la sociedad de esta tierra crezcan en la capacidad de acoger y respetar la identidad y la experiencia de los pueblos indígenas. Espero que se encuentren caminos concretos para conocerlos y valorarlos, aprendiendo a caminar todos juntos. Por mi parte, seguiré animando el compromiso de todos los católicos respecto a los pueblos indígenas. Lo hice en otras ocasiones y en varios lugares a través de encuentros y llamamientos, y también por medio de una exhortación apostólica. Sé que todo esto requiere tiempo y paciencia. Se trata de procesos que tienen que entrar en los corazones, y mi presencia aquí y el compromiso de los obispos canadienses son testimonio de la voluntad de avanzar por este camino.
I trust and pray that Christians and civil society in this land may grow in the ability to accept and respect the identity and the experience of the Indigenous peoples. It is my hope that concrete ways can be found to make those peoples better known and esteemed, so that all may learn to walk together. For my part, I will continue to encourage the efforts of all Catholics to support the Indigenous peoples. I have done so at various times and occasions through meetings, appeals, and also through the writing of an apostolic exhortation. I realize that all this will require time and patience. We are speaking of processes that must penetrate hearts. My presence here and the commitment of the Canadian bishops are a testimony to our will to persevere on this path.
Queridos amigos, esta peregrinación se extiende durante algunos días y llegará a lugares distantes entre sí. Sin embargo, no me permitirá responder a muchas invitaciones y visitar centros como Kamloops, Winnipeg, varios lugares de Saskatchewan, en Yukon y en los territorios del noroeste. Aunque esto no es posible, sepan que están todos en mi recuerdo y en mi oración. Sepan que conozco el sufrimiento, los traumas y los desafíos de los pueblos indígenas en todas las regiones de este país. Las palabras que pronunciaré a lo largo de este camino penitencial están dirigidas a todas las comunidades y a los indígenas que abrazo de corazón.
Dear friends, this pilgrimage is taking place over several days and in places far distant from one another. Even so, it will not allow me to accept the many invitations I have received to visit centers like Kamloops, Winnipeg, and various places in Saskatchewan, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Nonetheless, please know that all of you are in my thoughts and in my prayer. Know that I am aware of the sufferings and traumas, the difficulties and challenges experienced by the Indigenous peoples in every region of this country. The words that I speak throughout this penitential journey are meant for every Native community and person. I embrace all of you with affection.
En esta primera etapa quise hacer espacio a la memoria. Hoy estoy aquí para recordar el pasado, para llorar con ustedes, para mirar la tierra en silencio, para rezar junto a las tumbas. Dejemos que el silencio nos ayude a todos a interiorizar el dolor. Silencio y oración. Ante el mal, recemos al Señor del bien. Ante la muerte, recemos al Dios de la vida. Nuestro Señor Jesucristo hizo de un sepulcro la última estación de la esperanza ante la cual se habían desvanecido todos los sueños y solo quedaban el llanto y el dolor y la resignación. Hizo de un sepulcro el lugar del renacimiento, de la resurrección, donde comenzó una historia de vida nueva y de reconciliación universal. No bastan nuestros esfuerzos para sanar y reconciliar. Es necesaria su gracia, es necesaria la sabiduría afable y fuerte del Espíritu, la ternura del Consolador. Que Él colme las esperanzas de los corazones, que Él nos tome de la mano, que Él nos haga caminar juntos.
On this first step of my journey, I have wanted to make space for memory. Here today, I am with you to recall the past, to grieve with you, to bow our heads together in silence, and to pray before the graves. Let us allow these moments of silence to help us interiorize our pain, silence, and prayer. In the face of evil, we pray to the Lord of goodness. In the face of death, we pray to the God of life. Our Lord Jesus Christ took a grave which seemed the burial place of every hope and dream, leaving behind only sorrow, pain, and resignation, and made it a place of rebirth and resurrection, the beginning of a history of new life and universal reconciliation. Our own efforts are not enough to achieve healing and reconciliation. We need God's grace. We need the quiet and powerful wisdom of the Spirit, the tender love of the Comforter. May He bring to fulfillment the deepest expectations of our hearts. May He guide our steps, take us by the hand, and enable us to advance together on our journey.
Our Holy Father has concluded his discourse, in which we heard several times his personal apology, at which point several times those here present clapped in recognition. Now we see two women climbing the stairs up to the stage. Our Holy Father in conversation. As they leave the stage with the gift in hand that they've been given.
Sung in the gravesite this morning at the same time. This is a song that was sung at the gravesite this morning, at the same time honoring the person that stood up and was able to come and not only say I'm sorry, but went one step further and provided some form of, asking for forgiveness, but at the same time moving forward and doing things for those people, and succeeding generations of those people. So it's with that we sing this song again for those children and for our great leader and Pope.
again, we hear Jerry Saddleback, traditional Indigenous singer, singing in Cree. It's also a way of showing acceptance for the Holy Father's apology and an invitation to all those present in their own way and according to their own personal time to accept that invitation to move toward reconciliation. And Chief Wilton Little Child now with a headdress in hand, speaking with the Holy Father, and now putting the headdress on the Pope. Spontaneous performance of the Canadian national anthem here by one of the participants, speaking in an Indigenous language. And now we have the greeting of various dignitaries and other chiefs here present. This has been, as we have seen, the we do hear some crying in the crowds. This has been a very emotional day, as we know, having brought back for many a past that never can be truly left in the past, as we even heard the Holy Father say that there are memories that are present that need healing. But that in acknowledging and not forgetting those memories will help us move forward. This is the first event our Holy Father is taking part in here on his 37th apostolic journey. He's here in Canada visiting Maskwacis. Maskwacis Cree name is an unincorporated community. We're in central Alberta in Canada, just about 70 miles south of Edmonton. A Catholic mission was established here in late 1884 and 1885 by a priest named Father Constantine Skolin.
Well, we watch these images from Maskwacis, Alberta. We come back to our studio in Ottawa. We'll continue showing you the coverage of the Pope's historic visit. And yeah, I mean, today I am here, he said, in this land along with ancient memories, preserves the scars of still open wounds. I'm here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that again of asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry for the ways in which regrettably many Christians supported the colonizing mentality and ways and the powers that oppressed the Indigenous peoples. I am sorry. I would like to throw it to you, Father, and to you, Cecil, some moments or something that the Holy Father said in his address that really touched you.
Well, to hear him speak with such simplicity but sincerity, it was very moving, and the people received it very well. You heard several times applause, which is not usually what you get for an apology, but it was a concrete way to express the reception of what he said. There's a heavy burden of history, and it was lightened a bit by what happened today. I think what was interesting is the Holy Father tried to insert what he was doing today into the history of Canada, the history of the church in these lands, and the history of salvation. You know, he talked about how this encounter between the Europeans and the Indigenous peoples could have been mutual enrichment, but turned out not to be. He talked about how much good was done by the Christian missionaries who came, but they participated in a government scheme, the overall effects of which, he said, were negative, in fact, even catastrophic for some of the Indigenous communities. And then he ended by talking about the history of salvation. He said that there is the answer to evil is good, the answer to death is life, and not what we provide, good and life, the Lord of good and the God of life. And he framed it then in the resurrection of the Lord Jesus there. So taking that historic moment and inserting it into three different histories is what he did in a very beautiful address there at Maskwacis this morning.
Yeah, pointing it again, and I guess that's a challenge for all of us to keep pointing upwards. You know, keep pointing upwards, because staying true to the values of the gospel is the only way that we are going to get through this as a country, as a world. Yourself, Cecil?
Where to start? I think it was very powerful the way in which he spoke about the shame unambiguously. He used he spoke about evil committed. He spoke about that these are processes that must penetrate hearts. That this is not something that finishes today. That really it's it's a constant new beginning, right? We're not beginning this. We spoke about earlier apologies. You spoke about the ways in which these harms have been addressed in the past. So this is a new beginning, and there needs to be continually new beginnings. And I think
Did it speak to you? Did it speak to you? You know, I mean, you're in that community. Your mother was in that community. You know, do you think it will resonate? Do you think it will?
I think we saw that it resonated. Watching people there, I could see that it was very powerful. And before we, when we were speaking earlier, I mentioned Michael O'Brien looking out at this crowd around him for the TRC event in Inuvik, and how he saw in their faces this tremendous capacity for love, for forgiveness, and
That was
that's
a
what you see.
spontaneous singing of the
Yes.
national anthem in an Indigenous tongue.
And you could see she was struggling to get through that. It was very, very powerful.
Yeah, that was a real moving moment for today.
So I think there are many people who are moved by this and who are hopeful. This is an opening of doors of hope again, and it's up to each one of us really to ensure that we follow through with that. And the Holy Father has invited us to embark on that process, or to renew our commitment to that process. And yes.
So, Father, I have to ask you, though, there was some talk, confusing talk about, perhaps made some clarification on Mother Earth. There was, can you speak to that before the addresses happened?
Well, it's not clear that was actually on the program. There was a kind of a PA announcer who was doing logistics, and then did a little freelance spirituality riff at the end there. So I wouldn't put too much importance on it. Well, some people, that's one of the things Cecil was talking about earlier, about when you have different cultures, sometimes you have to find your balance. I'm not sure what he intended by that. There is a tradition of honoring God in creation. Not only is there a tradition, that's Orthodox, Christian belief. And then sometimes it might slip over into sort of honoring creation without God. I wouldn't worry too much about what we heard there, because it wasn't even part of the official program. But if people heard it and were wondering, I don't know what it meant, but what the Holy Father said, which is the critical part of today, situated, of course, the Christian gospel in the traditions of the Indigenous people, which we saw beautifully reflected in many of these instances. And now we have the Holy Father who's going to lead the Our Father. It'll be prayed in Cree, which is another example of that enculturation.
Our Lord, and say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The kingdom come, with the will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, and we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The Lord be with you. Blessed by the name of the Lord. Our help is in the name of the Lord. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Well, we watch these images, these final images from Maskwacis in Alberta. We're going to leave. We have to leave on a sense. Can we leave on a sense of hope? Father, I'll let you go first here.
Well, we don't really have an option. I mean, that hope is at the heart of the Christian faith. There's a lot of reasons for hope even before the Pope got off the plane. This has been something that's been going on for 30 years. We're going to see that this afternoon at Sacred Heart. So there's no reason to be kind of despondent about it. This was a high point. This was a high point and a new beginning, but not the beginning. So there's many reasons for hope, but certainly that this was done on this land in such a direct way, with the people there able to receive what the Holy Father said, is certainly a very hopeful note, certainly.
Cecil, I'm being told we got to wrap. I'm going to save your hopeful comments for when we join us. When you join us, but both of you will come back tonight for our broadcast. I'd like to thank you both for joining us here today, Father Raymond de Sousa and our friend Cecil. As we close this portion of our coverage via EWTN, As we close this portion of our coverage on EWTN, we want to invite you back later today. That is 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when the Holy Father meets with Indigenous peoples and members of the parish community of Sacred Heart at Sacred Heart Church of the First Peoples, Edmonton, Alberta. This is a national Indigenous church in downtown Edmonton following several years of restoration after an accidental fire. This parish will reopen its doors. It's going to be a beautiful, beautiful moment tonight. You've been watching live coverage of Pope Francis in Canada on EWTN Global Catholic Network.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.